You're listening to a Soundbox podcast made for the York Theatre Royal. My name's John Hughes, and I'm here to tell you about a production at the York Theatre Royal by the Old Bomb Theatre Company. Now, in February next year, Old Bomb are presenting an evening of short works by Anthony Minghella. Cigarettes and Chocolate, which was originally written for radio and broadcast on BBC Radio 4, a duet for voice and dancers called Hang Up, and Days Like These, a monologue that first appeared as a TV film made for Comic Relief. I caught up with the director, Paul Osborne, and a member of the cast, the actress and playwright Hannah D, and we talked a little about a few different things, like what drew Paul to these particular texts, and how difficult it was to adapt a radio play for the stage. So I'm sitting here talking to Paul Osborne, who's an associate director of Old Bomb Theatre Company. Okay, and I'm also talking to Hannah D, who's an actress, and what's your involvement in Old Bomb?
I'm currently playing Lorna in Cigarettes and Chocolate.
Okay, so what drew you to the text? How did the choice of the Minghella plays come about?
This came up because I wanted to do something a bit different, and I wanted to do something that linked with other people's talents, choreography, music, set design. And over the summer I came into contact with a designer and a choreographer, and Cecily, who's the associate director of Old Bomb and is also acting in Cigarettes and Chocolate. She and I discussed some ideas, and I'd come across Cigarettes and Chocolate several years ago. It was a play that I'd chosen a speech from to audition when I was auditioning to work on radio as an actor. But in the same edition there was a play that was written for two dancers to perform to the soundtrack of a phone conversation, which is Hang Up. And the other piece was a monologue, a very touching, poignant, and amusing too, an amusing monologue by an older woman. And we just felt that span of age, working through from people in their 20s to an old woman in her 70s, and combining a monologue, dance, and a fairly intense one-hour drama would be a really good evening of theatre, and perfect for the studio because they're quite text-heavy plays. Cigarettes and Chocolate was originally written for radio, but it's certainly a very stageable play, and that intimacy that you have in the studio where you're sat so close to the actors makes a play that was written for radio and therefore is something quite cerebral and is something you hear and comes inside your head. Well, that's perfect for the studio because you're right on top of the action if you're sat there.
Right, yeah. So, if the play was originally written for radio, what was the original format? How did that work? Can you tell us anything about the play that is specific to the radio genre?
Yes, without giving too much away, the play, which won lots of awards, Cigarettes and Chocolate, it starts with a series of answer machine messages. So Answer Machine sets the play in the 1980s, and we'll do that again. But what's really clever is that it introduces you to the characters fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. They all leave their own message on the machine. But also it's revealed that there's some dramatic tension there because it's quite clear that the person with whom they're leaving the message isn't returning calls. So straight away it poses the question, why? And we won't give too much away now, but we're going to acknowledge it's a radio play, but straight away take it from the world of radio and put it on a stage. So come and see it and you'll find out.
And there's it's an interesting idea that Minghella had, that the central character doesn't respond. Is that the thing you were trying to...
Yes, yeah. The central character who does speak to the audience, but in the play she has given up speaking. She refuses to speak. And the interesting theme of the play is the effect that has on her friends, her relations. I think if you imagine that situation where a close friend just won't answer you, how does that make you respond? And I think what's interesting in the play, it forces people to reveal things they wouldn't normally say because she's silent, and also reveal things to to her other friends as they go in search of a reason for why she's given up speaking.
Yeah. And we know, and I don't know how many people, outside the theatre world generally know about Anthony Minghella. I mean, people probably recognise his work because, if you, a film like The English Patient, a film like The English Patient that he wrote and directed.
Yeah, he directed and he wrote the screenplay. He also wrote the screenplay for Cold Mountain, The Talented Mr. Ripley.
Yeah, so people know his work maybe more than they know his name, and so as a result, I think maybe quite a lot of people are not aware of his writing. I've never actually read any of his theatre work or any of his writing. So what drew you to the text? What is it about the text that you particularly liked? His style? Yeah.
Well, the other interesting thing about Anthony Minghella is that he started his career in Yorkshire. He studied for a PhD in Hull, and then went on to lecture in drama there. So he has York connections. I think that he's quite a unique writer because his work is so naturalistic, and yet none of it is boring. It's so well put together. So the characters speak with pauses, they repeat themselves, they hover around the same sentence over several sentences, trying to get meaning across. And that also makes it very funny, incredibly real. I mean, you can see why he succeeded as a film writer, but that style of film writing had a very early basis in his theatre writing. And that's quite unusual. A lot of playwrights, I think, write very precisely and correctly, and I think to come across a writer who's full of that hesitation and underlying meaning is quite rare. And it's very moving writing. It really is all about the stuff that isn't said. I know we hear about that in Chekhov's writing and things like that, but it's even more apparent, I think, in Anthony Minghella's work.
Hannah, as a writer, do you have any opinions on his work that you might want to share?
I think it's fantastic. I love the way Minghella writes, and I completely agree with you about the sort of rambling quality that he has. He kind of goes around the houses, and he never actually says. A lot of the time, his characters they're so kind of hesitant with how they are feeling that they can't communicate, and I think he really captures the beautiful miscommunication between characters in his world. And one of the things that I love about Cigarettes and Chocolate is it's really hard to pin down what it's actually about, because it's about so many things. It's got a really nice ambiguity about all the issues within it, and I think that's a really good sign of a good play, because it means that it can be so many different things to so many different people, and that's what great plays, art, paintings, pieces of music should do.
Yeah, we found in the rehearsal process so far, we found quite a lot of interesting. It's generated quite a lot of discussion. The play between the actors and the director and actors, and I think possibly that's because that quality that it has, that it could be read in a lot of different ways.
Well, exactly, and I think what Hannah says is right about the ambiguity. That also presents a challenge to me as a director, because you often need to set out with these things, knowing exactly what it is, what story you're going to tell. And because there are so many stories in this, that makes that process quite difficult. So for me, more than anything in the process of creating this production, it's about allowing the characters to bring their own stories onto the floor, and just seeing how they work together. I think it's very difficult to determine the absolute direction this story will go. I've got an image of how it will look and how it will sound, but what stories people will get from it, that's exciting, because I think people will find their own.
Yeah, I mean, that leads up Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say that that's interesting that you've got an idea of how it looks, because obviously it's written for the radio, so it's not written with a very clear way of staging it. And for me as an actor, that was one of the things that kind of drew me to it, the challenge of finding a way to present something that was originally written as a very intimate kind of relationship between the radio and the listener, so that you're very much inside these characters' worlds, their inner worlds, and inside their heads. But then you put them on stage and you have an extra dimension to play with, because you can see them and you can see what they're doing and how they're moving in space, and that's going to be great fun to kind of get into that and work out this extra sort of depth to the play that is there but is not intended to be shown.
The other reason why I was interested in this work was that when Anthony Minghella died about a year or 15 months ago, it came as a shock to a lot of people because he died in his early 50s. He died before his time. He was in the middle of several writing projects, and it's funny, sometimes you can hear about someone's death and you just accept it and say, well, that's sad, well, but life goes on. But I was really affected when I heard that Anthony Minghella had died, because I remembered how much some of his writing had affected me when I first saw the film Truly, Madly, Deeply, when I heard Cigarettes and Chocolate on the radio. And you know, some of the films that he's written for, I do remember very magical moments in those. And it felt like you'd lost someone that you kind of knew, even though I've never met him.
And also, of course, you know, he would have gone on to do a lot more work, which was interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think he's a lot of actors who worked with him, Jude Law, Nicole Kidman, Juliet Stevenson, would say he was the best director that they ever worked for.
Really?
You know, I think he was held in a really high esteem by actors because he understood their needs as an actor in what he wrote for them and in the way he directed them.
Yeah, and you're reading at the moment, I read part of it as well, his book Minghella on Minghella. And yeah, his prose is really easy to read, isn't it? But full of interesting ideas.
It's so
rich.
And
really rich, but very
full of advice, and you know that you're getting gems from someone who was extremely talented and working at the top of their game when they died.
So what about Days Like These? Do you want to...
That's the one I know least
about.
I'll
talk about that, yeah. And the third piece, Days Like These, is a monologue by an older woman. It was originally written for comic relief for film, but that's just as relevant for the stage. And what's really nice about the writing is that it's not sentimental at all, and yet it's an older woman looking back on her life, reflecting on the good and the bad times. And I think it's that ambiguity of, you can take the sadness from it if you want to, but also you can take the joy from it. You know, and I think every other line takes you in another direction. And I think different people would hear those lines differently themselves. So you might have someone laughing in the middle of her speech while the person next to you is dabbing a tear from their eye. And I think, again, it's very powerful because it's one woman talking from the space she spends most of her life in now, an armchair in her own flat on her own. And it's as if we're invited into her world because we're so close to her in the studio, sat around her. And she's just revealing this life story, and I think that's what makes that piece particularly powerful. And you know, it will be the last piece of the evening, and a really nice way to wrap the evening up. Again, you know, we're looking there at someone at the end of their life, and you can compare that with the pieces you've seen earlier, people who are setting out on their lives.
Well, it sounds like a good place to finish.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.